Disclaimer, dude. Here we go.
Joanna from Atlanta, Georgia, and you're listening to Beyond the Box.
Hi, I'm Rayburn Johnson.
And I'm Steve Sensenig.
And this is Beyond the Box.
Here's your invitation to explore life outside the box of institutional religion.
This is a place where there are no walls to restrict our search for truth as we embrace the ambiguity of defining our life in Christ.
So unbuckle your seatbelt,
recline your chair,
throw caution to the wind, and get ready for the ride that is
Beyond the Box.
Ray, my man, it's Beyond the Box time with your old co-host, Steve Sensenig. You remember me?
Beyond the box. Steve is here, and here's Steve.
Woohoo! Oh, well, we'll have to pay royalties. I can't sing more than like 3 notes of it, or we'll have to pay royalties on it. So. Gosh, I miss those old days of the Tonight Show. Johnny Carson was something else.
You know what I miss even more, though, are the old Saturday Night Lives.
Well, yeah, that's true.
I have to
Old
say,
Saturday Night Lives were the best.
I used to love me some Saturday Night Live, and every now and then I pull out the best of Chris Farley DVD just to give myself a good tickle.
Yeah, well, some people would think that you need to go even farther back than Chris Farley to get to the good stuff.
Yep. When they say good old days, they're thinking like Bill Murray and 1970s.
Yeah,
that predates me a little.
Yeah, well, me too, actually. But my favorite was Phil Hartman. I always enjoyed Phil.
He was awesome.
He was amazing. The voices, and I used to love how he would when he did live stuff. Like I think he was on the Tonight Show one time, and he said. He asked the audience to give him a language and a product, and he made up a commercial that sounded like he was doing it in that language. So, like, he had to do a commercial for a ballpoint pen in German, and it was just all like it sounded like German. It was very convincing, and he's just, I can't even pretend to do it, but. Oh goodness!
Well,
man,
I have to say one of my favorites is got to be Chris Farley and the Chippendales.
Yes, with Patrick Swayze.
Yes, that's got to be one of my favorites. And if you haven't seen that, then friends, please do YouTube it. It will give you
YouTube it. Yes, yeah, and boy, that just makes me sad though because both of those guys are gone.
Yeah.
Chris Farley and Patrick Swayze. But yeah, that was a lot of fun watching them do their Chippendales routine.
Oh my goodness!
Chris Farley just had a way of, he had a lot of physical humor, of course. But he just seemed to like almost spoof himself somehow. I don't know how you.
He was like slapstick for Gen Xers.
Yeah,
he was like Generation X slapstick.
Yep.
If the Three Stooges had been born and had their career in the 1990s, Chris Farley is what it would have looked like.
Yeah, he would have been one of them.
Yes, he'd have been the fourth stooge.
The fourth stooge, yeah. Oh gosh, well, it's so good to be back with you, bro, and I'm excited because we're actually going to get to see each other face to face here in a little bit. Whoop. Yeah, we're up in Pennsylvania right now, but we're finishing up here in the next couple days and heading down through some southern states on the way to Texas, and I'm going to swing by your way and hang out.
We are pretty stoked about it, my friend. I'm fired up that we actually get to see you in the flesh.
I know, and I rarely have gotten to see you in the last few years, and when I have, it was always in the bookstore where you used to work. Now I get to just hang out with you in the real world.
And we don't have to whisper anymore.
No, that's right. Oh, man.
You can come to my house and talk as loud as you want, brother.
And we can talk about any heretical ideas we want to, right? Oh, man.
Look at old days.
When you think about it, Ray, we did our 5-year recap several months ago, but when you think about it, over the 7-8 years, whatever it's been that you and I have been talking, our lives have changed so drastically.
Golly, yeah.
We've gone through several interesting transitions.
We're 5 years, 3 kids, and like 3 states later or something.
Yes, exactly. I know. I was, well, of course, we both started in North Carolina, and then I moved to Virginia, and then I hit the road, and then you moved to Tennessee, and it's
been
quite
a
different.
Crazy ride, brother. And the cool thing is, here's what I love about it is sometimes you think after so long you've kind of arrived at the station or whatever, and you realize no, not at all. We just keep evolving. We keep changing. This journey with God just keeps expanding and getting bigger, and the rabbit hole keeps going deeper. And you know, anymore, the thing that I'm loving is I remember so many of these conversations we've had over the years is, you know, we've compared it to free falling, to skydiving, and how for a while it's really, really scary, and then it gets exhilarating. And more and more, I have to say, the fear is just so much less than it ever used to be. And the exhilaration is so much greater than it used to be.
It is.
You know?
It is. Yeah, that feeling of falling, I know when we first started talking to each other and sharing, you know, those tentative conversations where we weren't sure how far we could go with our comments. And I remember that sense of like, it was more a sense that things were crumbling around me. Yeah. And that I was losing something, and now it's at a point where it's just like I'm enjoying that free fall, and I'm enjoying the sense of journey and just the whole process of living life in a free way. Is really, really amazing. I'm much more settled in my unsettledness, if that makes sense.
Well, you know, when you remove the fear of punishment, it's just like you have this room to breathe and room to grow, and suddenly you can explore ideas without the fear that maybe this is the precipice that leads to the pit, you know. And it's so much, you know, this journey is just a trip, man. It's a real trip. And I'm so thankful to get to do it with you.
I know. I was just thinking the same thing. It has definitely been way more meaningful having someone like you in my life to talk about these things with and to bounce ideas off of. And I'm really excited too, because lately we've been expanding our Facebook community and the amount of involvement that we get with other people online. And you know, I know some people want to. Well, I don't know how to say this, but some people feel dissatisfied with just online interactions. You know, they feel like, well, it's not really the same as real life relationships. And I recognize that there are differences, but I've come to really enjoy the cyber relationships that we've built with our community, and people that, you know, like Heather Sterling up in Alaska, who knows when we'll ever be able to see her face to face, but the relationship of interacting online or even in a group podcast, still to me fulfills a lot of need for community in my life, even when it can't be physically in the same room like we would love to be. But
I have to say, Steve, I don't know, when we did the group cast, and hopefully you're going to get to jump in that next one.
I hope so.
When we did the group cast, you know, it really is in a lot of ways, the way technology is now, it's almost like you are in the same room. So
that's
suddenly
so cool.
we get all these people from literally around the world. I mean, not just different countries, but different days. You know, there we are on Saturday night, and Ulf Jetter is in Sunday morning already, and we're getting to do this thing and actually like we're in the same room. I mean, it really, we live in an awesome day, brother.
That's true, and it really has, I think, a big part of what's happening worldwide in terms of spiritual things is a result of technology bridging some of those distances and bridging some of those gaps. So I know when I first, in fact, Christy and I just had dinner yesterday with a couple and their 7 kids who left the institutional church a number of years ago. And this is a couple that I knew when I was much younger as a kid. They're probably about 10 years older than I am. And we have a similar upbringing in common, and now we have a similar experience outside the church too. But anyway, it was really interesting just talking with them and recognizing that for all of us, when we first started to have those ideas, we thought that we were the only ones. We thought that we were completely isolated in thinking these things. And then you get online and you start Googling and you start searching out different books and different podcasts, and suddenly you realize, I mean, I know for me it was such a shock to find out that there were tens of thousands of people, at least, if not millions, who had been asking the very same questions I was asking.
Yeah.
And suddenly you feel a little bit less weird and a little bit less heretical, for lack of a better word, and you feel vindicated in your own questioning. And I know that was certainly the way for you and I getting together and going, wow, you've thought that too?
Yeah.
It's so cool. And so I see, like, I don't think it's a coincidence that when we started this the group on Facebook a couple weeks ago and made it a closed group and told people, hey, you can feel safe to talk here because people aren't going to see what you post, the discussion just exploded.
Well, and Steve, I want to apologize because I think in the group cast I actually mentioned the fact that it would show up on people's Facebook feed, but I realized later on that I was wrong, that it doesn't show up on your Facebook feed. So please know that if you're going to hop in the conversation on the group page, that it's not going to show up on your Facebook feed, that you're safe, you can say anything you want there, and your other friends are not going to see it. So I really appreciate you clarifying that, Steve, because I need to announce that now.
Yeah. Well, and I do want to remind people that obviously, in this cyber world, nothing is extremely private, and so there's nothing, if you really are afraid of somebody reading something that you wrote, you need to take that seriously. You need to think about it. But for the most part, what's shared in that group is completely safe because nobody's going to copy and paste it and, start a big brouhaha over it. I don't think, most of us aren't really on the radar for a lot of people anyway, but yeah, it's to the extent at which it can be safe, it is.
Exactly.
and I'm delighted to see, like I said, just the explosion of conversation. It was almost like the Beyond the Box community was just waiting for their voice to be heard,
Yeah.
And you and I have been opening up for discussion online in a lot of ways, but I had kind of wondered why we didn't get more people commenting. We get a lot of private emails. People pour their hearts out to us in emails, but online comments were just kind of sort of sparse.
It had slowed down a whole lot for sure.
Yeah, but man, we opened up that group, and at the time that we're recording right now, we've got like 148 members in there, and we certainly welcome anybody else to join us there. But it was like from day one, just people started posting, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? And sometimes I'll see something get posted, and I'll go 10 minutes after it's posted, and there's already 8 or 10 comments.
Yeah, it's great. It's so fun,
really cool.
And the thing I love about it is the fact that it just happens organically, and there's no moderators, it just happens. And if you want to jump in, if you only want to read it, you can just read it, or if you want to jump in, you can jump in, or if you want to jump in and then jump out, you can do that. It's just a lot of options for conversation for sure.
And if you don't know where that group is, you can find it from our Facebook page, and we'll go over all those details at the end of the podcast too. But we certainly invite anybody to jump in there who wants to and join the conversation or start your own.
And speaking of conversations, we on the idea submission page, I was kind of going through that today because it's been a while since we've addressed any of the ideas on the idea submission. Just kind of looking through them and threw a few out to you to kick around, and we both kind of settled in on an idea that was submitted by Joshua Craig, I think way back in, it was back in April actually.
It was earlier this year.
I'm just going to read his idea submission, and then we'll just start kicking off here and see where we go.
Let's do it.
And please know, disclaimer, dude, here we go. Please know we are not the experts. So when we start talking about this topic, this is, we talk about in the intro, two guys thinking out loud. I think is that still on our intro?
Is it still in our intro?
I don't know. It used to be. But anyway, if it's not on there, let us throw that in there now. We are two guys
definitely
thinking
in
out loud. So
the typed description on our website, I know it's in there.
By no stretch of the imagination will this subject be exhaustively covered, but we hope we give you some food for thought, and we hope we give us some food for thought. So anyway, Joshua on April 3rd of this year said, "Love the podcast and would love a discussion on PanEntheism. There's a significant historical tradition of panentheism in Christian mysticism, And whether it's Christ filling up the cosmos in Colossians, or God being all in 1 Corinthians 15, or whether it could serve as a sort of philosophical prequel to the discussions of hell, I think it's a discussion worth having. A view of God wherein God is integrated into his creation is a part of a holistic picture of nonviolence. I think, anyway. Smiley face. We always love the smiley faces.
Exactly. And, Ray, I want to say about this, because this is, again, one of these cases where I thought I was having some really crazy out there ideas, and then I find out that lots of people, even throughout history, have embraced some things that we're talking about. I did not know until that comment was posted back in April. I don't think I'd ever heard the term PanENtheism before. I had heard of pantheism, which is Peter Pan is God, but but I had never heard PanENtheism, which sometimes, apparently from what I understand, can sort of meld with pantheism in a certain way, but it really has a distinction in it with that extra syllable. And so there was a situation where I was like, I had this kind of crazy idea, what if we're all sort of part of God? And I knew pantheism basically just says that everything is God.
Right.
But panentheism goes in some ways a step further, or at least a step in a slightly different direction, and says that everything is part of God, but God can still be a being greater than all of creation. So like the universe all is part of God, but God is still the source of life for the universe and has some identity in being outside of the universe as well, is one way to look at it in panentheism. And I don't know, it's I guess what surprised me is finding out, as someone recently mentioned in the discussion group, I think on the day that we're recording this was when this was posted, that some of us are finding out that we're way more Eastern Orthodox than we ever thought we were.
We've been finding that out for a while, haven't we?
Yeah, and I didn't even know anything about Eastern Orthodox like 5 years ago.
Yeah. It's really interesting. Panentheism. I've heard the term for several years, but I've always heard it in a negative light. It's always been presented as well. It's not as bad as pantheism, but it's the closest next near thing to it. But
it's not like 100% heretical, but it's 99.9% heretical.
Exactly. But the thing I've been finding more and more is there's different panentheisms, and it's just as you and I have talked about, and you said this a long time ago on some podcasts, and it's really stuck with me, is he who defines the terms wins. So
right.
So I think it's really important that we define it from the onset, because
so we can win.
Because it's all about winning. Podcasting is all about winning. Podcasting 101. At the end of the conversation, you must be right. The end.
Oh, wait, we said we weren't the experts, didn't we? Oh,
but, it really is true. I mean, it's...
yeah, it is.
Depending on... There's all sorts of different versions of panentheism. So, maybe we want to unpack that a little bit, and maybe talk about, do we think it's right? Do we think it's wrong? Mm-hmm. Where do we see truth? Where do we see that maybe we wouldn't agree with it wholeheartedly?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. What do you have in the way of definition?
Well, when I say definitions, maybe I should clarify. I'm not going to give you a different, but I know in reading about it and stuff, there's all sorts of different iterations, nuances, I guess you could say, of it. And I know that, for instance, the Eastern Orthodox, they would say that many of them would believe in a version of panentheism, but more so, they would keep God separate from creation still. That creation, Eastern Orthodox talk a lot about divine energies. That's a really popular term. So that God's divine energies are what was used to create the universe, but God's essential person is not necessarily a part of the universe.
Right.
So that, for instance, it goes beyond God just being the creator, because God's the sustainer as well. God has to sustain everything. And therefore, it goes beyond just this deistic view of God creating things and then, leaving it to spin on its own. But it doesn't go as far as to say that the universe itself is contained within God, or that, like, for instance, process theology, I know, which I've been becoming more and more familiar with over the last few years, really takes pantheism in a whole nother direction or PanEntheism, sorry.
PanEntheism.
Takes PanEntheism in a whole different direction, where God is, that the universe and God, while they wouldn't go as far as the pantheist in saying they're the same, they come awful darn close in saying that the universe is as affected by God as God is by the universe. That those things are equal. And that God is as much changed by the universe as the universe is changed by God.
Which is kind of what led toward open theism,
Exactly.
ultimately, I think, in some areas. Yeah, and I think, well, just from a strictly linguistic aspect, the distinction between pantheism and panentheism, pantheism is all is God, and panentheism is all is in God. So that from the Greek, that middle syllable makes a huge distinction, I think. Although, again, there could be some overlap in that concept. I have to say, in all honesty, Ray, I've come at it from a slightly different angle in starting to look at this before I ever knew about the term, and that's strictly from what we read in Scripture. There were these little clues to me, or that said to me, that maybe there was more to the relationship between God and man than just creator and creation, master and slave, or father and child. And some of the key things that kind of jumped out at me is the first one, I think, really that jumped out at me was Jesus' prayer in John 17, when he prays that we would be one with him and the Father, as he and the Father are one. I may be paraphrasing that a little bit, but it was almost like he was drawing this Venn diagram with all kinds of overlapping circles. And you have a set of the Father and a set of the Son, and they overlap and become one. And he's praying that we, as his followers, would be one with each other and with them. So, this Venn diagram just becomes this huge overlap of all these circles, including us and the Son and the Father. And that stuck out to me for a long time as this clue that maybe, at least in Jesus' mind, there was something a lot more to this relationship. And then I think probably the next part of that really stuck with me was, and I can't remember exactly where it is, but I think it's Peter that says, uses the phrase partakers of the divine nature.
Yeah.
And that phrase to me, again, seems really significant. That there's something other than just worshiping God, something other than just being adopted into his family. That when he says we are partakers of the divine nature, there, again, I have this picture of a Venn diagram where there's some overlap, at least. That something about God's nature becomes part of us, or we become part of him, And then the third passage that jumps out in my mind is Paul in, I believe it's Acts 17, I think it is, where he quotes the poet saying...
on Mars Hill?
Yes. And he says, in him we, I always forget this.
Live and move and have our being.
And have our being, yeah. I always want to throw breathe in there somewhere. But this and that's the angle of panentheism that I saw when I started to read up on this word, and I'm going, oh, okay, this is where we are so much connected with God that he is the source of our life. And I think it harkens back to the Genesis story, the creation story of God breathing into Adam life. And so I think the essence of God breathing into man is putting his nature in us. So I don't know. That was kind of what started it for me, was looking at what we saw in Scripture and going, wait, there's these little clues from Genesis to almost Revelation that there's something stronger than just accepting Jesus as our Savior and believing in him. There seemed to be something much more organic and much more life-giving in that relationship.
I see, and like I think about Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 talking about that God's ultimate end, the eschatological hope, is that God will be all in all. And I've often thought about that, even way before any of these conversations happened. Like I remember years and years ago reading that passage and going, this is so bizarre. He's not just saying that we'll be in him or he'll be in us, but he says that God may be all in all. Like that God will consume the universe, not in consume is kind of I want that word not to have the wrong connotation. Not that God's like it's
not a destructive thing.
Thank you. That's the word I'm trying to say. It's not a destructive thing, but in other words, that God, it's almost like we came from God and will be absorbed back into God. And that maybe the truth is maybe nothing. The truth is we've never been separate from him.
Right.
The fact that, we start out in that metaphor of the garden where, God walks with mankind in the cool of the day, breathes into him the breath of life, like you said. There's just this organic unity where we're completely naked before him. We don't have there's nothing between us and him. We're as close to him as we could possibly be, and then we end up in that place that Paul says, where God may be all in all. And to me, I don't know, the traditional notion of Christianity has become less and less satisfying for me, that God has this creature-creator relationship where it's two completely distinct things, the creature and the creator. More and more, I just don't see that as being the intimate union that, like you were saying, that Jesus talked about in John 17.
Well, I had heard it stated, and on several occasions, and I've actually seen it in like wall hangings and pictures and stuff like that. And I'm sure you came across this in your bookstore years, Ray. This, and I don't know what the source of it is, but somebody had said, basically there are two things to know. One, there is a God. Two, you are not him.
Yeah, I remember those. Yeah.
And which actually grammatically should be you are not he. But anyway, I remember that combined with, taking phrases out of Ecclesiastes like you are God in heaven and here I am on earth, so I'll let my words be few. That traditional Christianity seems to always want to emphasize the otherness of God.
Yes.
That God, and not just otherness, but separateness of God.
Yeah.
Which I find ironic because, like you were talking about, if part of the lie that we have fallen into as a human race is that we are separate from God, if that's the lie, the truth is we're not separate from God. Mm-hmm. And so it seems ironic to me that the religion that claims to have the corner on the truth, even the capital T truth, is so bent on emphasizing separation between us and God, both in our pre-conversion state of sin, that, God turned his back on us, couldn't look on us, etc., separated himself from us. And even then in our oneness in Christ, like I've heard so many people talk about that prayer in John 17 and say, well, when he said that he prayed for us to be one, he didn't mean in the same way as he and the Father are one. Like they totally
But he actually says that.
But he says it. I know. It's like, because I remember, 4 or 5 years ago, asking a pastor, like, okay, when Jesus says earlier in John, I and the Father are one, and then in John 17, he says, I pray that they would be one with us in the same way that you and I are one. Why do we assume that he meant something different? Why would he suddenly change the way he talks about it? And I think that the most logical way to look at that, and the most consistent hermeneutically, is to say that when Jesus used the term one over here, he meant the same thing as when he said one over here.
That's right. That's right.
So
it's a one-to-one relationship. Right?
Bingo. That's good, man. That's good. So, the very people who claim to have a consistent hermeneutic and, you just interpret things the way that they're, and it's like, because we're not talking about John said it once and Peter said it over here, or
Right.
John said it, and Paul said it. We're not even talking about different authors. We're not even talking about different books.
Right.
It's not John and First John.
Exactly.
It's right in the same book by the same author. How can we twist that to say, 5 chapters later or whatever, it means, or 10, whatever it is, it means something completely different? I think that just begs the question of why are we so opposed to the idea that we are one with God?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it comes down to, going back to talking about Eastern Orthodox theology, the defining event in Eastern Orthodox theology is not the crucifixion or the resurrection, it's the incarnation. It's and the incarnation is inclusive of the crucifixion or resurrection,
Right.
but it's even bigger than that.
But it's a package deal. Yes.
And the reason it's so important, and we've talked about this with the idea of theosis in Eastern Orthodoxy, is this melding together of God and man. And the problem
Right.
is, I think part of what we've done in Christianity is we've made that a unique event in Jesus.
Exactly.
We've made it a unique event to where we elevate Jesus over, and we actually juxtapose Jesus to our relationship with God. So Jesus has this relationship with God that's special compared to our relationship with God. Whereas
Yes, we could
it
never have
seems
that.
like the idea of theosis is, and Scripture bears this out, that Jesus was the firstborn among many
Right,
brethren.
of many.
John 3:16 calls him the only begotten, but then later on, John calls him the first begotten. He's no longer the
Right.
only begotten. He's the first begotten, and he says he's the firstborn among many brethren. In other words, there's tons of us out there that are that are supposed to experience this exact same kind of relationship, like you said in John 17 that Jesus bears out, the same relationship he has with the Father. I've been reading something recently. Jim Douglas, who I've just grown to love. He's a peace activist, part of the Catholic worker movement. I'm reading some stuff by him right now, and he talks about the use of the term "the Son of Man," and I can't remember the Greek for it, but he goes over and over in talking about the term "Son of Man" and showing how Jesus was not using it as a title for himself, but he was actually trying to say, I'm
human.
I'm a demonstration of
Yeah.
what God made you to be. I'm the true
I've
human.
wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I've
I'm
wondered
the true
about that.
human. And Walter Wink talks about this. I'm the true human, and I'm trying to demonstrate to you what the new humanity, as part of the
Yes.
new creation, is to look like. And that new humanity is to be God infused. It's to be filled with God. It's not where humanity is to be in this subservient relationship to God, where He's the master,
Right.
He's the Lord, we're the slaves, we're the servants. But it's God infused humanity where I would almost say, or I guess I would say that it's
You're about to.
I'm about to.
You're about to say.
Let's see. Wait for it. Wait for it. That I think it's supposed to be such a divine unity, humanity unity, that you don't know where one ends and the other begins.
Exactly. And this is, I've come, and I've shared this some on the podcast before, Ray, but I've really come to the point of embracing a much more mystical approach to my faith than I don't know, what's the...
Rational or...
Yeah, I guess that would be the antithesis, wouldn't it? And so recently, I don't know if I mentioned this on here before, but recently I read John Shelby Spong's book about the fourth gospel.
Did you just say that?
And
did you say
I
that
did
on
just say
air?
that. I did just say that. I read John Shelby Spong. I am a heretic. There's so much that he writes in there that I'm like, okay, I got to think about this for another 5 years. I'm not there yet. But he basically points out the fact that from all of his study, he has come to the conclusion that the what we know as the Gospel of John, the fourth gospel, is in essence a mystical approach to faith. And it makes me realize that so much of my understanding of our oneness with God comes from that fourth gospel. That, what I've just mentioned, there were other verses that I mentioned outside of that gospel, but the notion of Jesus being one with God and us being one with Jesus and with God, that comes straight out of the book of John. And so I'm thinking this goes along with this mystical approach that, being one with God, being part of the divine, that's not a rational concept.
No.
That's
How can you wrap your noodle around that, right?
Exactly, you can't, and it's a very mystical approach to faith. But to me, it makes so much sense to see me at, like exactly what you just said, this human unity with God. And it has bothered me for a long time that we have, in fact, we did a podcast years ago called Jesus the Man.
Yeah.
And we talked about this fact that what bothers me so much is that we have put Jesus in this other category of something so unique. And so what do? We take all the miracles he did and we say he did those because he was God.
Right.
He was able to walk on water because he was God. Well, how did Peter walk on water? He wasn't God, was he? Jesus healed the sick because he was God. Well, how did Peter and John heal the sick? Jesus raised people from the dead because he was God. How did the disciples raise people from the God? How did Paul raise raise people from the dead? How did Paul raise someone from the dead? All of these things, and of course Jesus said, all the things I did, you will do, and much greater things. So to me, I'm like, let's stop this nonsense of Jesus being in this unique category. And this is honestly, I want to address this because this has come up in some of the discussions online. We've talked about some on the podcast. I think sometimes people misunderstand where I'm coming from. I am not so much anti-creeds as I am anti the barriers that those creeds create in our understanding of God. I have said for several years, my problem with the doctrine of the Trinity is not that I don't believe that Jesus is God. It's not that I don't believe that there is even a sense in which the Trinity could be an explanation for how God has revealed himself. My problem is it doesn't go far enough in describing God. That I think the councils stopped at a certain point of religious safety for them in saying, we believe this about the Godhead. And then it got distorted, I think, in the Athanasian Creed, where it says, if you don't believe it exactly like this, then you're condemned. You're anathema. We did not allow ourselves to embrace the greater mystical truth, I think, of who God is and how we relate to him. So when we pigeonhole Jesus into the second person of the Trinity, I'm not arguing against that because I don't think Jesus is part of God or that he has divine nature. I'm arguing against it because it removes us from the divine nature by defining the Trinity as such. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I mean, taking what you're saying, kind of what I've been thinking as you're talking is, in many ways, worship can become a substitute for discipleship. In that if we worship Jesus as something other than us,
right,
then we no longer have to imitate him. Because if he has something we don't have to aspire to be like him. We can just worship him and honor him and respect him and be thankful that he did it so we don't have to. But the thing about Jesus is he doesn't say, worship me because I'm going to take up my cross so you won't have to. He says, no, take up your cross and follow me. If you're not willing to take up your cross, you can't follow me and be my disciple. So one thing I wonder with what you're saying about the creeds, and this is just a thought that was just occurring to me as you were fleshing that out. Could it be that the key of what you said there for me was when you were talking about that the people, the framers of the different creeds, and maybe they weren't going far enough because of religious boundaries. Could it be that those boundaries were even political in that a Lord and servant relationship reinforces the monarchy that's already in existence at the time?
Right.
Because if you were to create this flat view of God, where God is standing under humanity, lifting them up instead of standing over humanity, pushing them down, then it would undermine all the political structures that were in place, such as Constantine, such as, Theodosius, all these different, it would have taken all of these emperors that were in place when all these creeds were made, and it would have made them just like everyone else. So I think in some ways, and this is something that you've argued for about with the Nicene Creed, in talking about that we can't just take a decision that was made or a creed that was framed in isolation from the way in which it was done.
Right.
Because we look at the way in which it was done and the way the emperor, came in and in his quote unquote glory and with his magisterial presence and oversaw the whole thing. You can't separate that from what came out of it. And so could it be that maybe one of the reasons, and this is hearkening back to a lot of the things we've talked about surrounding Christian anarchy, is if you have a view of a Lord who's more about washing feet than about having hands raised towards him, or he's more about lifting up the oppressed than he is about being the oppressor, if that's the kind of Lord you have, it completely undermines governmental authority, power structures, be it within the church or within the government. And so to do that not only topples the religious institution, but it can threaten to topple society itself from the top down.
Yes, absolutely, it can. And I think, you're hitting pretty much on where I was headed with this, because I think, let me kind of reframe a little bit of what you said, put a little slightly different spin on it. I think there was absolutely heavy political influence in what took place with the formulation of the creeds, especially the Nicene Creed. I think what also we see happening is that the councils and the Nicene Creed and later creeds that were developed as well, they were reactionary. I don't think anybody would argue that point. They addressed tension that they saw within the church. They addressed conflict that they perceived was there, between Arius and Athanasius, stuff like that. So the creeds themselves, I think if we place them in context historically, we see them as addressing a conflict of that time. But I think where they made a mistake and where we might make a mistake in elevating those creeds too highly is that we view that statement then as, okay, this is how everybody needs to view it. This is the only correct way of looking at it. And I think what they did is they just took sides in a debate. Whereas to me, I'm really hesitant to say some of this, Ray, because I don't want people to misunderstand even more what I'm trying to say about this. I feel like I've gotten this reputation as the anti-creed guy, and maybe it's somewhat deserved. But the debate about the nature of Jesus, I think, missed the greater point of who Jesus was. I think what you and I are saying about the true human, about Jesus being the example of who we are and what we can become, I think that whole question got completely missed in Nicaea, because they were basically saying, was he always God or did he become God? Well, okay, that's not a bad discussion to have, but all that ended up happening was saying he was always God, and therefore if anybody says that he became God, they're a heretic and they need to be banished. And so it just became about settling that question, and yet it missed the greater question of what was Jesus teaching us?
Well,
the debate isn't about his nature, it's about who are we in relationship to him. Go ahead.
Exactly. Could it even be about, we've talked a lot on the podcast about the idea of progressive revelation. And we've done that a lot in the form of talking about the 66 books of the canon, of the Protestant canon. And showing that there's a progressive revelation within that. But if we look at the work of God as being progressive, that the revelation that God gives us is progressive, could it be that there's not been a time where this bottom-up structure could really be revealed in the past like it's being revealed now? Because now you have, with the emergence of democracy during the time of the Enlightenment, you had kind of the very beginnings of this idea that, people could run a society as a group instead of having to have this triangular top-down authoritarianism. Although it wasn't really established, the idea was in seed form there. But then you have things like the emergence of the internet, where now every Tom, Dick, and Harry can have a blog. Guys like us can have a podcast, and you can go
Lord
on
help us.
Wikipedia and you can actually write the dictionary.
Right.
So now instead of the experts, and we've talked a lot about this, but instead of the experts having the monopoly on truth, you have people from the bottom up getting to really get in on the framing process of what we're going to call truth. And so in saying that, could it be that, while the Nicene Creed was good for its time, or the Chalcedonian Creed was good for its time, et cetera, could it be that those societies weren't ready for a Jesus that was just like us, for a Jesus that was all about elevating us to the status of sons of God?
Well, I think that's a great question, and because I think if I understand what you're saying correctly, they were a product of their own culture. So they saw things like you said, a lord and servants, a Caesar and subjects. They saw the world through those lenses, and so that's kind of what they figured the kingdom of God must be like. The irony for me is that so much of what was happening politically at that time, and I'm racking my brain to try to figure out how we can bring this back to panentheism, but
we'll get there.
I think we'll get there eventually. I think so much of what was happening politically at that time caused them to miss so much of what Jesus actually taught. Because if you look at what Jesus taught about the kingdom of God, it looked nothing like Caesar's reign. It looked absolutely nothing like a top-down.
It was the
mentality.
anti-reign.
It was. And so, but you think about the fact that at that time there was basically one Catholic Church, and their whole method of structure was top-down authority. You had the representative of Christ, the personification of Christ, if you will, in the form of the Pope at the top. And then everybody listened to him to get the revelation from God. So it's like, I just keep looking at it and going, they were so off in their understanding of the kingdom that I just think it's really dangerous to look at their theological conclusions and go, well, they must have been right about this, or they must have been led by the Spirit in this, because I think they were working with such a skewed view of how things were structured in God's economy. And I mean, I don't, maybe I am anti-creed. I don't know. I keep not wanting to get that reputation, but I just think by that point already in church history, when Constantine took over, there just was so much baggage being brought into the church, and so much had slipped away from what Jesus taught, that I think we have to be willing to think outside of those boxes and say, okay, so I guess this does come back to panentheism in the sense of, okay, what did Jesus talk about our relationship with God? How did he describe it? And if he describes this oneness that we're seeing, and we have no problem accepting it in a Trinitarian sense, then why can't we accept it in a Googleitarian sense of, everybody in the kingdom is part of this being that we know as God, and yet God is so much bigger than that because he is the source of life for everybody that's in that kingdom to begin with.
Okay, so at this point, Paul Walker on the Facebook group, I threw out something just basically saying, "Hey guys, we're going to talk about panentheism tonight. Do we have anybody that has any thoughts?" And I think there's a appropriate quote for what we're right where we're at in this conversation. I'm just going to read this quote from Paul. He's quoting from N.T. Wright in the book Simply Christian. N.T. Wright says, "The one true God made a world that was other than himself, because that is what love delights to do. And having made such a world, he has remained in a close, dynamic, and intimate relationship with it, without in any way being contained within it or having it contained within him. This God appears to take very seriously the fact that his beloved creation has become corrupt, has rebelled, and is suffering the consequences. This is something the pantheist cannot cope with. Even PanENtheism has a hard time giving a serious account of the radical nature of evil, let alone of what a good God might do about it. So, with what Paul's the quote that Paul's given us from N.T. Wright here, one of the things that I was thinking about was, basically N.T. Wright saying love drove God to create, but when he created, he was in a dynamic and intimate relationship with creation, but that doesn't mean that the creation was either contained within him or he was contained within it. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
The first couple times I read that, I wanted to just embrace it, and I have a soft spot in my heart for N.T. Wright anyway.
Sure.
But I gotta say, Ray, I'm not sure that I understand where he's getting that initial premise from, because he goes on to say then that basically that PanEntheism has a problem, which this may be a legitimate observation, that it has difficulty understanding evil then, because if everything is part of God, how can there be evil? I guess is what he's getting at, right? Yeah. So, but I question the initial premise that the way God chose to create necessitated an otherness that is not absorbed in his identity somehow. I think, I'm just not sure that I get the initial premise.
Anytime I disagree with N.T. Wright, I do it with a little fear and trembling, just because he's such a heavy
hitter. That's exactly what I'm doing.
He's such a heavy hitter, and I'm such a worm intellectually compared to N.T. Wright. But I'm going to say in this quote, I don't find myself in complete agreement with him. And one of the things I said to Paul in the Facebook group, I love the fact that he put that in there. I was like, within minutes of me putting that out there, he had this great quote from Simply Christian. I'm like, how the heck did he do that? Does he have this on his computer where he can search PanEntheism and find his entire library where that was amazing.
Maybe he did.
But anyway, the thing that really got me, that kind of stood out to me in it, was in N.T. Wright's basically saying that God's created the world out of love, but he's really separate from it. Even though he remains close, he's really separate from it.
Right.
And then he goes on to say, creation has become corrupt, has rebelled, and is suffering the consequences. And that's where I stopped and I went, wait a minute. If we believe in the incarnation, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, then we believe, and if we believe in the incarnation, then whatever we want to say about all of this stuff that we're talking about tonight with our relationship with God, we would all say Jesus is God.
Yeah.
Which begs the question, if the incarnation is true and Jesus died on behalf of our sins, then it's not that we bear the consequences of our sins. It's that God himself bore the consequences of our sins. And God took on our corruption, which 1 Corinthians 5:21, he who knew no sin became sin, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. So God actually took on the consequences, and God suffered our consequences. Like Moltmann talks about the crucified God. God was crucified on our behalf. So God participates not only in our joy, in our beauty, in the love, but he also participates in our suffering. So if that's true, it begs the question to me, how can we parse it out and separate God so that we can say, well, he's here, but he's not here. Or, well, he's close, but he's not within. Because I'm going, I think when Jesus moved into the neighborhood, as Eugene Peterson says in the message where he talks about, that he made his dwelling, tabernacled among us. He says he moved into the neighborhood. I think when Jesus moved in the neighborhood, he never moved out.
Right. I agree completely.
And if that's true, then even if we want to say technically, if one wanted to say this, and I don't know that I would be comfortable saying it, but if one wanted to say that in the beginning God created and it was separate from him, we can never say that again after the incarnation.
See, you just nailed it for me, because I think that was kind of my hesitancy with NT's quote, is that it just delays the problem in my thinking. it's still like you said, even if you want to accept that there was some separateness at one point, that did not remain. That God did not remain separate. I think that I appreciate what NT's trying to say, but I think it's trying too hard to maintain something about God that we feel a religious need to maintain.
I think you're hitting the nail on the head. He's trying to honor God's transcendence, and in doing so, he's taking away from God's immanence, which I think is a common mistake in Orthodox in traditional Christianity.
It is, and it's a tension point that we certainly can't explain in purely rational terms, which again gets me to this mystical sense that there is it any coincidence that mystical and mystery start with the same 4 letters? I think, and it's funny because I've never been one to really like the answer of, oh, there's just a tension that you have to allow. It's just we can't explain this mystery. Like that's how the Trinity was always explained to me. It's just a mystery. I've never been really comfortable with that, and yet I'm starting to become more comfortable with the notion that when we're talking about moving beyond rational either or definitions to a both and definition, that there is something about that makes sense to me now in a mystical sense. So I think but again, I'll go back to the creation story. However, the Jewish people believed about creation, they incorporated in their story this notion that God breathed into man, God breathed into Adam. And I don't know how you can have separateness when the Creator is the very life source of the creation. We're not talking about me creating a little remote control car and running it around, powered by batteries. We're talking about a Creator who is the very energy that fuels the life of the creation. That's not separate. You can't separate those two. And one of the things I know you and I, Ray, have really grabbed onto in the last 7-8 years is the notion that all of us have the stamp of God in us. We all have this image of God in us. And one of the ways that we learn to love our enemies is to learn to see God in them, to recognize that is not, like Paul says, we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. It's not about this person standing in front of me. It's that person has the divine in them. So how can I treat another part of the divine with disdain? How can I treat another part of God? It would be like saying, I love the Holy Spirit, but I can't stand Jesus. Or, I mean, you can't separate that out. And so if the very nature of the creation is inhabitation of source of life from the divine, I'm not sure that you can start with a premise of separation. I don't, and I think that lends credence to the idea that our separation from God is a lie, because we can't be separated from our very life source. We can't pull away from that.
Yeah. With what you're saying about how loving the enemy and how important it is to recognize the image of God within them, to see God within them, isn't that what was borne out in the story of Saul on the road to Damascus? And Jesus says to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?
Why are you persecuting me?
Not why are you persecuting these people over there or my followers
who represent me? Or
why are you persecuting me? Because he identified with the fact that when and Jesus says, when he talks
whatever you've
about
done to the least of these.
Exactly, in the judgment, it's not did you get your doctrines right? Did you affirm or assent to this this creed? No, it's what did you do to the least of these my brothers? Because if you've done it to them, you've done it to me.
Right.
The thought came to me just a minute ago, and it's never hit me before, but this goes a lot with like what we're talking about with what we've talked about before with Philippians 2. And I remember Brian McLaren talking about Philippians 2 and really turning it on its head by saying that the lordship that's mentioned there is not our kind of lordship. It's like a subversive use of the term Lord, where he's flipping it on its head and saying, Lord, this is what lordship looks like. It looks like humbling yourself. It looks like putting yourself at the lowest position, etc. I thought to myself, as we're talking about this dichotomy, the seeming dichotomy between immanence and transcendence, what if God's transcendence is actually defined by his immanence? So that the very thing that makes him transcendent is the fact that he's immanent. Because any of the rest of us, if we were in his position, we would be transcendent, where we would be untouchable.
Right.
But the way in which God is transcendent is that he's not like that. He uses all of this power and all of this sovereignty and all of this stuff to actually subject himself to us, which is just mind-boggling. I mean, you think about the incarnation here, and we're coming up on Christmas in a month or so. Here's this God that is the sovereign Lord of the universe, of everything that is, has, or will be. And he comes to earth as a baby. This transcendent God doesn't appear on a white horse rolling into town to overthrow the Roman Empire. He comes as a baby. And the more I think about that, I'm thinking, this king isn't the kind of king that we're used to. You know, this transcendent God isn't your mama's transcendent God, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's not the same transcendence. He transcends because we could say if transcends means that he goes beyond us in humbling himself and putting himself in subjection to us, so that, like we've talked about with the idea of open theism, so much so that God subjects his universe and even his own decision-making to us, which is mind-blowing.
Yep. Well, and here's another thought, too, about this separateness, Ray, is as we're talking about this, I'm thinking the ark of Scripture, I don't mean the one Noah built, but or the one they carried around to the tabernacle. The overarching story of Scripture, to me, when you zoom out and look at the big picture, you see over and over again God resisting separateness. When Adam and Eve sinned, in that story, what you have is God coming after them and saying, "Where are you?" When you see Israel, he brings them out of Egypt, he brings them to the mountain, and he invites the entire nation to the mountain. It was not his idea to have Moses speak for him to the people. He was resisting that notion of being separate from. He wanted everything to be part of it. And so it's like over and over again, and you see it in the cries of the prophets. You know, they're constantly telling the people, return to him. Well, how could they return to him if he was the one that left? So if God is constantly resisting separateness, that tells me that there's a really good reason for it, which is probably the fact that he can't be separate from us. So the incarnation to me is kind of like he just puts all the cards on the table. He's like, okay, you continue to separate yourself from me. You continue to think that you're something other than me. Look, I'm going to show you I and you are one.
Yeah, wow.
Man and God are one. So the incarnation to me actually drives home the point that humanity is part of the divine. Not that the divine became human so much, although you can use that language as part of the mystery, but it is the culmination of his efforts to show that there is no separation between us. I don't know. I'm not sure what to do with that, but that's kind of where I'm at right now.
You know, and I think in saying that, I think another, it seems like so much of, it's like we talked about before, so much of theology is formed by the culture in which it finds itself. Right. And one of the things I think in saying this, and maybe this is one of the reasons that we come down so hard so many times on the institutional version of Christianity, is that God resists commodification.
Yeah. Yeah.
God will not be bought or owned.
Mm-hmm.
He will only give himself freely.
Yeah.
He cannot be manipulated. He can't be earned. He can't be bought. He can't be, he can't be consumed.
Mm-hmm.
But he refuses to enter into a relationship other than one that's free.
Right.
And so God comes
That's
to
good.
earth, and instead of making himself the sole property of the Jewish religion, he talks to Samaritans and Syrophoenicians and Roman soldiers who were the
Romans, yeah,
oppressors, and instead of making himself a king that was only to be encountered by royal blood and all these kinds of things, he makes himself a peasant baby that anybody can follow if they're humble enough to come after him. I think you're onto it, Steve, when we're talking about this idea that the incarnation is as much about revealing us as it is about revealing Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
About revealing the
so.
true nature of who God is. Let me ask you, I want to read another comment from Joshua Joshua Craig, the one who gave us this idea back in April. When we put out today on Facebook, help us think through this. Joshua came back and said, "Oh man, I'm pumped you guys are doing this." And then, I asked him, I said, "Well, you got any thoughts before we record about this? Where were you kind of coming from when you had this?" And I'd kind of like for us to address this before we wrap up. He says, "If all things hold together in Christ, then violence towards creation is violence towards Christ. PanENtheism inspires an ecologically informed theology. Jesus may be crying out from the earth and animal kingdom, 'Why are you persecuting me?'" So if PanENtheism is true insofar as we can relate it to humanity, can we go all the way and relate it to the entirety of creation and say that the entire creation is a part of God or contained within God?
Yeah, and I think, in all honesty, Paul's language in Colossians and also in, I think in 1 Corinthians, like you were talking about earlier, I think Paul's language certainly lends itself to that concept that, Paul constantly draws all of creation into the redemption story, into the reconciliation story. So, he says, like, creation groans under the weight, and all creation, I think it's Paul that says all creation eagerly awaits the...
Romans 8,
And then the whole all in all, he refers to the fact that everything that was made came through from Christ, and that, like, I think Paul constantly makes it a broad sweeping all of creation, all of the cosmos. So I think that there's while I still feel some baggage from my past to say, I don't know if I'm ready to go that far to say that tree outside the window that I'm looking at right now is part of God, because that sounds so much like pantheism, which of course I was always taught was such a heretical thing. I do think that we have to allow for that possibility that somehow it does, again, to reference Paul's language, include all of creation, not just all of humanity. And so, and I think the language of the New Testament where it talks about a new heaven and a new earth, and I think there's a lot of symbolic, metaphorical language being used there. I don't think it's necessarily literal. But I think we have to leave that door open for the notion that PanENtheism gives us the respect for all of creation that perhaps God was asking us to have in the first place.
Yeah, as caretakers and as I've wondered myself, and I'm sure people have probably thought this as they've listened to us over the last few years, but we talk a lot about nonviolence, and there seems to be a quick straight line drawn from human nonviolence to the animal kingdom as well, so that a lot of people that embrace nonviolence end up as either vegetarians or vegans, because of a conviction that nonviolence means nonviolence. And in the efforts of full disclosure, I'm not completely there yet. I have a lot of questions, and I've thought a lot about it, and still continue to wrestle with it. I mean, some of the things, and this might be proof texting for me, or it might be me just trying to wiggle my way out of something.
Right.
as a carnivorous American man,
exactly,
who lives in the South and likes fried food. I hope that's not what it is, and I'm very open to the possibility that, and even the probability that in some ways I'm fooling myself. But some of the things I think about are, Jesus eating fish after the resurrection.
Right. Right.
I've really wondered about that. Like, of all the things he could have done after the resurrection, why did he eat fish? And then, the sheep being lowered for Peter and being told, rise, Peter, kill and eat, all these things. And of course, he was making another point with that. It wasn't about the food. And then Jesus talking about...
Well, yeah, but I don't think he would use a metaphor that
would lead
remember,
to confusion.
I remember somebody questioning that with me one time about, it says that to rise, kill and eat, but that it was just a vision. And I said, well, would God have given him a vision of a prostitute and say, go sleep with her?
Right. Well, if your name's Hosea, yeah.
Well, yeah, but yeah, he was told to marry her. He was told to find a prostitute and marry her. There's a big difference, right?
Not in the biblical sense. There wasn't. That's kind of the way you got married.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. But I think all that to say, I don't think God would use a metaphor and a vision that was completely contradictory to how He expected us to live in real life, too.
Well, and some of the things I think about are, Jesus, there's one place in one of the Gospels where it says that Jesus said it's not what goes into a man that defiles him, but what comes out of him. And then in parenthesis right there it says, and thus he declared all foods to be clean.
Right.
So these are things I struggle with because honestly, I completely see why people move from nonviolence into vegetarianism and veganism.
Absolutely.
Because I can totally see the correlation because, we're saying we believe that we're ambassadors of a kingdom that is now and not yet. And as ambassadors, we want to live as if we already were in that kingdom, which will include the wolf and the lamb laying down together and all those kinds of things. However, I'm like you. I want to see the idea of panentheism, that God is in everything. And I honestly believe that in some sense He is. But I still think that there's a specialness about humanity that doesn't extend to the rest of the created order.
I'm still there too.
And the Genesis story, when you read the Genesis story, whether it be metaphor or literal or however, God speaks everything into creation, but He breathes the breath of life into mankind. Right. And mankind is the only thing of which it is said that they're made in the image of God. So in some sense, I still think that the animal kingdom and the earth, while I would have no problem embracing panentheism and saying that those things are an emanation or a part of God, or however you want to say it, or contained within God, I really wouldn't have a problem with that. But I would say that there is a status that's reserved for humanity that isn't for any other part of creation.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's still a lot to wrestle through there because, again, to use Paul's language, everything about humanity seems to have an effect on creation, but and our relationship with God seems to have, a positive effect on creation. But yeah, I'm willing to be completely open and honest about that too. That I'm not there in terms of vegetarianism, veganism as part of my theology. There are other reasons that I've considered it. I haven't gone that route yet, but my son Dylan, our producer, was a vegan for a couple years. He has since modified that, but I remember at one point, not too long ago, sometime this year, us having some discussions as a family about it, and Christy asked me, how does your view on nonviolence affect your view about eating animals? And I don't have a good answer for it, other than I hope they're killed quickly and mercifully, but
Yeah.
that's not really a good answer for a nonviolent person. So yeah, it feels like there might be a discrepancy there, but at the same time, I completely concur with what you said, that it seems to me, and I always have this nagging feeling, I can't decide if it's baggage from my evangelical upbringing or if it's really truth, that there does seem to be some distinction placed upon humanity, that God doesn't seem to speak of the rest of creation in the same way. But I tell you what, I'm really open to hear from our listeners on that, because I'm sure there are some really good viewpoints out there among our community.
Let me be quick to say too, in saying that in saying what you and I are saying, we're not at all saying that means that that the commodification of animals and of the environment is at all acceptable when it comes to,
right.
For instance, the stripping
like
of
factory farming and stuff like
and the stripping of the mountaintops in West Virginia and the things like that. I mean, I think those are horrible things that God grieves over. The destruction of the rainforest. I think those are horrible things that God grieves over. The ways in which some animals are kept, like chickens that are kept in cages their entire life.
Right.
I think some of those things are horrible, and no matter what you think about vegetarianism or veganism, I don't think that's ever acceptable to abuse an animal,
right?
Simply so that we can have a fur coat, or that we can eat a meal. For that animal to ever be abused, or or that we can abuse the earth, excuse me, on and expect not to pay the consequences.
Well, and there are cultures that, from what I understand, I haven't fully researched this myself, but there are cultures in I think probably like Hindu areas that that don't discount the eating of animals, but they view it. How can I describe this? It's like they still hold the animals in high esteem.
I know a lot of the native cultures, a lot of the Native American cultures.
Yeah,
are that way.
and they almost choose to like honor the memory of the animal. So it's like there's this respect even while they're partaking of the meat, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So because I think what you're talking about is absolutely critical, that we never have an excuse for just abusing creation at any level. We don't have an excuse for just ripping apart and treating with carelessness, So I'm with you on that. I have a tremendous amount of respect for the vegan viewpoint. I think that it can be viewed as a very consistent philosophy. And I always respect when I see consistency in somebody's view. I have respect for that tremendously. It's kind of like the journey you and I have taken, Ray, in saying we used to view ourselves as pro-life in the sense that we were against abortion, and then we realized that there was an inconsistency in being pro-life and being pro-war.
All right.
And so for us, we had to recognize that, okay, if we are going to be pro-life at any point in the spectrum, we have to respect all of life in every way. And that, I think that type of, all of human life I'm talking about, that type of logic does cause us to still have to wrestle through what does this mean with regard to the animal kingdom and even the plant kingdom. I don't have good answers for that, but I think it's good to continue to wrestle through that. For me, the PanENtheism idea, I'm still very much, like I said earlier, at a point where I embrace the idea of oneness with God in terms of humanity's oneness with God. It affects creation, but I don't know to what extent it includes creation, if that makes sense. Creation being all the non-human creation. Obviously, we're creation too. But I definitely, excuse me, I don't accept pantheism if it's if all it means is that everything is God.
Yeah.
Versus everything being a part of God. Like that extra syllable in panentheism means a lot to me, and I think that I'm much more comfortable with the notion of panentheism than I am with pantheism, because
What-
to me God is still greater than the sum of the parts, maybe.
Yeah. Well, more and more, and I'm at the part of this podcast where I'm treading lightly because I realize 2 or 3 years down the road, I might completely change everything I'm saying now. But,
Yeah, sure.
but I'm saying this in that, I'm more and more seeing what seems to me to be two extremes. On the one extreme, you have like a hyper conservative evangelicalism that tends to believe that man is the only thing that matters, and therefore the earth is made for consumption. Therefore, we should
Right.
drain all of the oil out of it, use all of the trees in the forest, because Jesus is coming back soon and he's going to burn the whole thing up anyway.
Yeah.
Then it seems like on the other end of the spectrum, you have a group of people who are almost they've invested the same energies in protecting creation that they do humanity, to a point that they can actually stifle human progress or human need, because they have so much respect for creation that they almost let that trump the needs of humanity. And
Right.
while we all
Yes.
tend to think that we're fair and balanced, we all tend to think that we're in the middle. I'll say for right now, I look at both of those and see a little bit of extreme in both of them, and I tend to want to say, I think that there's something special about creation, but special as in, or maybe this is a really, really bad comparison, but if I had a zoo and I was keeping animals, it would be important to me that the environment was clean and healthy, and
Right.
that it was that the animals were able to enjoy it, and that it wasn't destroyed. But the reason the environment would be there would be for the animals who were there, not for them to
Right.
abuse it, not for them to rip it to shreds, but for them to sustain their life and to enjoy and to take care of. And that's kind of where I am with humanity. I see more and more, it's like God put us in this place to take care of it, but he didn't want it. He didn't want it to take precedence over us, but he also didn't want us to abuse it unnecessarily.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with you completely. I agree with you. I'll just share this thought before we wrap it up, that one possible way of viewing creation, if we're all part of God, a la panentheism, and God is the source of, and that means that God is the source of our very existence and our living, our being, then you could possibly view both plant, vegetation, and animal sources of food as part of the way in which God provides life to us.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'll just throw that out there.
Yeah.
I thought about that as we were talking. I'm like, not to try to rationalize anything, and I'm not even saying I agree with that. I'm just saying that might be one possible way of bringing that into harmony.
Well, I mean,
with a
one
panentheistic view.
one way or another, even for a vegan, something has to die
Right.
in order to sustain life. And maybe that death, maybe it's not appropriate to always look at those deaths in the same way, in that energy from that plant, it's that one of the rules of the universe is that the amount of energy in the universe never changes. It always
Right.
remains the exact same. It just transfers. And so
Yes.
the life of that plant transfers into our body, which sustains life for us. So I think you can, I don't know, I think you can almost get weirded out on some of these things to where,
Yeah.
in an unhealthy way, but simultaneously, I want to be very careful to say I am treading lightly, because I don't have all the answers. I've been thinking through some of this for a good while. I'm still not completely comfortable with all the answers I have for it, but I'm growing, and I don't want to.
Yep.
I don't want to stay stagnant, and I don't want to do something just because it's convenient for me. But simultaneously,
Right.
I don't want to jump into something that I see as possibly excessive or unnecessary.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, and now we've become beyond the lunchbox, apparently.
There's so many places you can go with that. I mean, there's beyond. Yes. We have so many boxes that we can throw in on that one.
Yeah, someone had suggested beyond the litter box. We could talk about cats, I guess. But anyway,
I hope they weren't saying the podcast was litter, but
Yeah. Right.
I hope that wasn't
a
veiled.
The litter box is usually.
I hope that wasn't a veiled
crap.
Jab against us, Steve.
Yeah, right. I don't know. It came from our buddy Jareen, I think, so, or one of those two. So. But this has been a great discussion, though, Ray, and I know we need to wrap this up for both of our sakes. It's getting pretty late, and you've got work tomorrow, and I've got some other stuff to do too. But it's been really good just to kind of talk about something that you and I aren't even settled on. A lot of times I think people sometimes think that we come to the podcast with our minds already made up about something. This is a good example of a topic that we don't really have any solid answers on. We're just kind of bouncing around and thinking off the cuff on.
Yeah.
And certainly, the discussion that results from this could be very, very beneficial to helping us think through it even more.
Absolutely.
Looking forward to what people have to say about this.
Yeah, and if you want to jump in the discussion, first of all, know, as we were talking early in the episode, know that we now have this Beyond the Box group page on Facebook, which is really, really making conversation much, much easier to keep up with, to be a part of. Mm-hmm. Go to facebook.com/groups/BTB podcast discussion. You'll ask to join there, which you will automatically be a member. You don't have to send in $2.99, and you don't have to, we don't send out prayer cloths. There's no strings attached.
No doctrinal statement to sign.
No doctrinal statement. If you just ask to join, you will automatically be accepted as soon as Steve or I are on Facebook and see that you've asked. So please, by all means, jump in the discussion there. Or another thing also, if you want to like the page, Beyond the Facebook.com/Beyond the Box. It's our Facebook page. It's the official page for the podcast where we post all of our episodes. We post most of the things in the discussion group as far as if things that we want to kick around, but that's usually where we'll put our episodes because that's where the most people are connected to us, so that they can see as soon as an episode goes live to be able to check it out and actually comment or etc.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep. Or you can contact us on Twitter if you'd like to follow us on there. We also announce episodes on there, and I think anything that we post on the Facebook page also automatically goes out to the Twitter feed, and that's twitter.com/BTB podcast. Mm-hmm. You can follow us on there, and you can call us. From our website. Well, actually, we should give the website too. Our website is, we got a lot of URLs now to give out, don't we, Ray? It's getting pretty complicated. BeyondTheBoxPodcast.com is our main website. That's where we actually post the audio for the episodes. You can listen. You may be listening to it there even now if you haven't subscribed through iTunes or some other podcast download service. But anyway, on BeyondTheBoxPodcast.com, you can go to the widget in the right-hand sidebar and click the widget that says "Call Me." Right? Is that what it says, Ray?
Just call me, maybe. Yep, that's it. Click the "Call Me" widget. You'll see
yes.
If you put your phone number and your name there, hit submit. Our answer service will call you back, or you can call us. If you're riding down the road right now, you want to pull off to the side, or you're on the treadmill and you're listening to us, and you want to pull out that phone and leave us an audio comment. You want to tell us you guys are crazy, or wow, that really resonated with me.
Yep.
Call 626-24-NO-BOX.
Crazy.
That's 626-246-6269. Just call us, will you?
Just call us, will you? That's right. Don't call us, will you? Call us Ray and Steve.
Don't call me Shirley.
That's right. Don't call me late for dinner, especially if you're serving steak. So yeah, I think that wraps up all the many URLs that we have to give out.
We'll
right?
find
Did I
5
forget
more
anything,
before
Ray?
the end of the episode, Steve.
That's right. Yeah, maybe we'll start like 10 more groups. And no, seriously, however you want to connect with us, please do that. You can even email us on our website. There's a contact form that you can use to send us a message. It's great to hear from you guys. And like we've said already several times in this podcast, we love the discussions that are taking place. I love the freedom that people feel just to jump in there and talk about stuff. And we're reconnecting with some old friends, connecting with a lot of new friends on there. Actually, tomorrow, if all things go as planned, Ray, I'm having lunch up here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with one of our listeners.
Awesome.
And so yeah, there's lots of ways to connect with us. We're just grateful for the community that we have. Grateful for the conversation and the fellowship. And Ray, it's just always fun to talk with you, man. I always come away from our conversations thinking, man, I never thought we could come up with new thoughts, but there's always something that just springs out of the conversation, out of the discussion, and gets my wheels spinning again.
Hey, I'm with you, bro. I feel the exact same way.
Well, actually, gets my wheels turning, not spinning. Wheels spinning is not a good thing, but gets my wheels turning. I have a tendency to mix up metaphors all the time. It's crazy.
Hey, I knew what you meant, and tell you, it is always good. I tell you, I always go away from these discussions charged up and with lots of fodder to think about for the next good while.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. All righty. Well, thanks, y'all, for listening. And, Ray, I'll catch you again soon on Beyond the Box.
Sounds great.